Welcome to The Making of Madrid, a podcast about Spain's capital covering history, culture, food, and much more. In the show, I try to get under the skin of the city, helping visitors, newcomers, and long-term residents get the best out of their time here. The show is presented by me, Felicity Hughes. I'm a Madrid resident and freelance journalist, and I work for a variety of different publications, including Lonely Planet, Time Out, the Financial Times. I actually have a confession to make because this episode almost never aired because I've been so overwhelmed with journalism. And I'm not complaining because I've had a blast writing 3 articles in the space of just 1 week. And they were all incredible opportunities to learn more about Madrid. One was very serious. It concerns a plaque that the central government want to place on a very iconic building in Madrid, which is the Casa de Correos. The Casa de Correos I talked about in an earlier podcast when I was talking about New Year's Eve, and everyone watches the ball drop from the clock tower at midnight. The building was built in the 18th century, but not many people know that during the dictatorship, there were political prisoners tortured in the basement. So I attended a protest about this and wrote quite a serious piece for the New European about the row between central government, who wants to install this plaque, and local government, who are resisting the move, and the reasons why both sides are really pitted against each other over this issue. So that was very serious. And then I had another piece that I was writing for Lonely Planet, which was an absolute delight to write, much more cheerful than writing about people tortured, of course. And this one was about Toledo in 11 places. And through it, I get to write about the history of Toledo and learn new things myself. And one of the things I dug into a little bit more deeper was Toledo's history of sword making. So I didn't realize before that they got this reputation for their fantastic swords in Toledo. I mean, if you go and visit, you'll see swords being sold on the street. And the reason for this is because Hannibal famously managed to defeat the Romans with Toledo swords. And then ever after, the Romans wanted to grab the swords. So I had a lot of fun looking into that. And I even spoke to master craftsmen who still make swords to this day. So look out for that piece because I feel like that's really entertaining. And then the last one I had to do was for the Financial Times. And this one was about what we call a bar de toda la vida, a sort of no-frills traditional Spanish bar that's a neighbourhood hub, and how they've managed to survive through the economic downturn in the 80s, through up until the present day when gentrification is driving up prices. This is a bar in Malasaña. I won't give any spoilers for that one either because I'm sure I'll post about it. If you follow my Instagram or you follow me on Facebook, you can see that. But I had such a blast because the family who ran this bar were just a delight, and it was really a fantastic experience. But of course, I realized that I have to put a podcast out every 2 weeks. And I've managed to be quite organized about this up until this moment when I had so much work rushing in. But I'm back on the case. Things have calmed down a little bit. I just sent that piece off to the Financial Times. So I can breathe a sigh of relief. And I have a podcast today that's going to be about street names. And this is one of my most popular posts on the blog. And I thought it was time for an update. because I, of course, am always doing research into Madrid and find out new things about streets all the time. But don't worry, if you haven't read the blog post that I've got, I'll do a quick summary of what I've written about street names so far, and then we'll go into more street names with fun stories behind them. Because one of the things people love about Madrid, and they tend to buy as a souvenir, are the beautiful street signs that tell you a little bit about the history of the city. And these are hand painted by a guy named Alfredo Ruiz de Luna González. He's a third generation artist from Talavera de la Reina, and he created the signs fairly recently in 1992. And yet I still think they're a great souvenir because they draw on deep ceramic traditions of Spain that go all the way back, of course, to the times of Al-Andalus, because famously Muslim craftsmen were the ones that cracked the trick to getting a beautiful sheen on a tile. So you have these lovely shiny tiles. Anyway, let's get cracking. So what we'll start with is maybe looking at the very famous map drawn up by Teixeira, which you can go and see if you visit the Museo de Madrid on Calle Fuencarral. It's on the ground floor, and in it you can see the city in the, let's say, it's the 17th century, sorry, because it was the time of Philip IV. What you'll see there is that the main thoroughfares like Calle de Alcalar, Calle de la Montera, Caballero de Gracia, these streets have their names written on them, but the rest of the streets did not have names. They were actually just given nicknames by locals. And the way the city was divided up instead was that people would talk a lot about where you might find different guilds in the city. So one of the most famous guilds would have been the haberdashers. And this is why still to this day, around the Plaza Mayor, you see haberdashers in an area that's now known as Pontejos. You'll also see the Calle de Botoneras, where the button makers lived, and they are my most favorite guild because they were a female guild that was actually powerful. The other female guild might be the washerwomen, and these were not powerful at all. But the button makers actually had deep connections with royalty. And I believe I've got a blog post about the button makers and a scandal that happened with the king, and they lost their guild license and almost their power if it hadn't been for the queen. But you can read about that in my blog. Pontejos is the name of a mayor of Madrid, who famously named the streets. Now, before that, the streets were sort of identified under the time of Charles III, a bit later in the 18th century, with as blocks. So this was to help the taxman. And you can still see those little block names, and it might say something like Visita Calle Manzana number 251. And these are also tiles, but these are much older than the tiles that you see that were hand painted. These tiles tell the taxman which block he's working with. And that's the royal tax code number that you're looking at. So they're white tiles with blue lettering on. So keep an eye out for that. So you might have just heard that was my cat. He's just woken up, but he's moving to his electric blanket where he likes to take a nap. Today, my husband's away in Tokyo at the moment, so I'm handling my cats on my own. Normally I go into another room and record, but they don't like being on their own. So I'm keeping them company today. Anyway, back to the Marquis de Pontejos. He's the guy who created the street's official names in the 19th century. And he did this by consulting a historian named Ramón de Mesonero Romanos. Now, Ramón de Mesonero Romanos was a great chronicler of the city of Madrid. He's actually famous for fighting tooth and nail, quite literally, for the city's heritage when he tried to stop Cervantes's house being knocked down on Calle de Cervantes. He also successfully managed to stop, I think it was Calderón de la Barca's house from being knocked down. That's on Calle Mayor. It's incidentally the narrowest house in Madrid. Anyway, so Pontejos consulted Mesonero de Romanos, and he told them all these stories about Madrid that go from the guild history, which is why we have the Calle de Botoneras, but also about more recent history. So you've got Plaza dos de Mayo, which commemorates the uprising against the French. Just going back a little while to Pontejos, just focusing a little while on this small area that's around Plaza de Pontejos, I really recommend going to visit it because one of the things I like about Madrid is, although it's a little bit overrun with tourists these days, you can still find small areas that aren't quite so overrun that are just a few streets away. So Plaza de Pontejos is a few streets away from the Plaza Mayor. And there you'll see one of the oldest haberdashers. And I believe it's called Almacén de Pontejos. Let me just check that. Yes, I'm correct. Almacén de Pontejos. Those of you who are interested in dressmaking, it's really a treasure trove. It's a kind of Aladdin's cave filled with buttons, ribbons, what have you. And when I was learning Spanish, I read a book called Manolito Gafotas, which I highly recommend for anyone learning Spanish. It's a children's book that's really, really entertaining about a little boy called Manolito Gafotas, Manolo, and he wears gafotas, so he wears glasses, and he lives in Carabanchel, where at the time the book is set, there was a huge prison, interestingly related to that story I was telling you about political prisoners in the Casa de Correos in Seoul, because when I went to see their testimony, they were saying that after being held and tortured in the basement of that place, they would be moved over to Carabanchel prison and serving out God knows what kind of sentence, because none of this stuff really went through the courts. They've been arrested by the secret police and were held for political crimes. The prison of Carabanchel was sort of infamous. They held not only political prisoners, but other kinds of prisoners. And so Manolito Gafotas lives right near the prison. And there's all these interesting sort of anecdotes about, him living cheek by jowl with this notorious place. It's written by a writer called Elvira Lindo. Elvira Lindo is a Spanish writer who is probably made a packet from this book. And she's also married to a very famous, very serious Spanish writer called Antonio Muñoz Molina, who wrote a book I love that's translated into English called In the Night of Time. Both of them are pundits. They see Spain from an interesting perspective because I believe they live in New York. The last time I checked, they live in New York. And so they have this international perspective on Spain. Antonio Muñoz Molina, his book, In the Night of Time, really raised the issue of the Civil War. He clashed a little bit with the great Madrid novelist Almudena Grandes, who also wrote about the Civil War, but basically the two of them are of this mindset that has recently sprung up, that we need to talk about the Civil War in order to heal from its wounds. Whereas in the past, the mindset was very much like, we don't talk about the Civil War in order to heal from its wounds. Anyway, lots of digressions today, but this is what you get for me doing things at the very last moment. But I hope it's entertaining to you. I do actually have a plan, if you're worried. We'll get back to Manolito Gafotas, because one of the first episodes that I read from his book is that he goes to Pontejos to buy a button. And it's a real event because he has to buy a special kind of button for his duffel coat. And this is the only place where you can get one, because they have all kinds of specialized stuff. But it's a real event for the little boy going into the town and selecting his button. And I just adore Pontejos. It's one of my favorite parts of central Madrid. So getting back to street signs, perhaps because we've gone on a little digression about the Civil War, it would be interesting to talk a little bit about current controversies over street signs. So there's an ongoing battle between the left and right wing about how streets are named. And this goes back to the Civil War, when at the beginning of the dictatorship after the Civil War, Franco, of course, renamed many streets. And we still have the legacy from that time. I live really near the Colonia de Moscardó. Moscardó was a general who famously took the Alcazar in Toledo. And before that, the Colonia, which is a kind of estate, was called Salud y Ahorros, health and savings. And Manuela Carmena, who was our left-wing mayor, wanted to change the name back to Salud y Ahorro, using the new Ley de Memoria Histórica from 2007. This means that the rights of people who suffered persecution or violence during the Civil War were now acknowledged. And so this means that her left-wing administration wanted to get rid of names like Plaza de Arriba España, Avenida Comandante Franco. There's lots and lots of these streets still here in Madrid. And she likes to change things up to different things. So, for example, under her administration, we then get the Plaza de Nelson Mandela, and we get the Plaza de Ley de la Memoria Trans. So that last one, it refers to a law that acknowledges the rights of trans people who are victims of violence. Now, my take on this is that, well, I'm actually stealing from a friend of mine, Leah, who writes the great Madrid blog, Madrid No Frills. And she pointed out that perhaps what they should do, rather than renaming all these streets as something like, Plaza de Ley de Memoria Trans, which is, let's admit, a bit of a mouthful, what we should be doing is not politicizing the names of the streets anymore. So instead, make them something like Plaza de la Margarita, named out of flowers, something a bit neutral, so that we'll stop this squabbling, which quite frankly just uses up time. in local government. Most definitely not go back to the whole thing about naming streets like deeply religious names, which is really, really common around where I live in Usera, where we have Amor de Dios, the love of God, streets like that. So yeah, something neutral. This is what we need. But I also love the street names that tell us something about the history of Madrid. And in the blog article, which I should be updating soon with these new ones that we've got, I talk about the Calle de Botoneras. I also talk about the Calle de la Esgrima, which is just around the corner from the Calle de la Espada. Not to be confused with espalda, by the way, for Spanish learners. Espalda is back and espada is sword, but I still get them muddled up now and again. And in Calle de la Espada, there was a famous sword hung outside to advertise the services of a fencing master. The school relocated and it wound up on Calle de la Esgrima. Esgrima means fencing. And this street was notorious because pupils often started having a fight to train and then they would devolve into a brawl. And that led to a ban on them training out in the street and they had to go and train inside the premises. There's also Calle de la Morreria, and the Morreria refers to a section of the city in the area that's now known as La Latina. And around there used to be, in medieval times, just after the Reconquista, which is when Alfonso VI's Christian troops took the city at the end of the 11th century. This is where its Muslim population settled. You have morerias in medieval cities throughout Spain, but then you have names related to the Moreria in La Latina if you look out carefully. So you might have Calle de las Aguas, and this refers to the fact that during the time of Al-Andalus, Madrid's underground water springs were very cleverly channeled by Muslim hydro engineers, and there is actually a conduit of water running under the Plaza de los Carros. I have a piece about that. If you Google Muslim Madrid, the making of Madrid, you can learn all about that little conduit that they discovered there. So that's fascinating to me, the history of the city reflected in these street signs. And not only that, you might have legends. So there's the legend of the Calle de la Cabeza, which I love. It's really gory. If you've ever been on one of my tours, you know I have a bit of a penchant for the macabre. And the Calle de la Cabeza is in Lavapiés. And it's the story of there once was, it's said, this is all it's said, it's all legend. There once was a wealthy priest living on the Calle de la Cabeza, and his Portuguese servant became very jealous of his wealth, and he cut off the priest's head and basically ran away to Portugal with his fortune. Somehow he became homesick for the area, moved back to the very street where the crime had been done, where the dirty deed had been done, and one day was visiting the Plaza de Cascorro, which used to be the site of the Matadero, the slaughterhouse of Madrid. And he was coming back home with a sheep's head under his cloak. If you've ever been to a Spanish market, by the way, you will see these sheep's heads still popular among elderly people as a tasty treat. It's pretty horrifying to me. I don't think I've ever eaten sheep's head. In fact, I've eaten all kinds of bizarre things like bull's tongue. at my parents-in-law house because they're very traditional types, but never sheep's head. Anyway, the night watchman found him leading a bloody trail down the street and asked him to halt and show what was under his cloak. And lo and behold, he found that the head of the priest was under the cloak, and he was put on trial for murder and hanged in the Plaza Mayor, where they used to do executions back in the day. Well, this one is pure legend, but I love a good legend and a good ghost story as well. I love a good ghost story. That leads me into my next street, which is a new one that hopefully I'll be adding to my blog. And that's the one about the Ribera de Curtidores. So I mentioned that the Portuguese servant was coming from the Matadero on Plaza de Cascoro. The Matadero is a slaughterhouse. The Matadero was once located at the top of what's known as the Ribera de Curtidores. And this curtidores are the tanners. So, of course, if you have the slaughterhouse, you also have adjacent businesses nearby. And this is the very, very steeply sloping street that is now the rastro on a Sunday. And rastro actually means trail of blood and refers to the bloody trail that ran down that street as the tanners were doing their business. So, sorry, I've just got to change the heat blanket for my kitties because now the sun's come through and they were lying on the heated blanket, but it's got too hot, so they can lie in the sunshine now. Yes, so the Ribera de Curtidores is where all the tanners were located. And going back to the whole thing about guilds, of course, their guild was located there, which means that there used to be lots and lots of leather shops down the street. And there still is a leather shop, and you will find lots of leather being sold at the Rastro, of course. But there's a wonderful leather shop that sells things like horse saddles. Like, I don't know who's going to buy a saddle for a horse in the middle of Madrid, but they sell them. And they sell bags and belts and all kinds of things. Spanish leather is still known for being very high quality. So yeah, that's the story of the Ribera de Curtidores. There's also Cava Baja. Cava Baja refers to the caves that once ran along the street. And Cava Baja used to start in the Plaza de Puerta Cerrada. And that refers to the closed gate that the king in the old medieval wall that went around Madrid. This is the time of the Morreria, and the king demanded that the gate be closed because thieves used to hide in the caves on the other side of the wall that ran along Cava Baja. Now, Cava Baja means the lower caves. So the medieval city wall ran along Cava Baja, but on one side of it, there were caves where thieves hung out. And if you were entering Madrid from the gate where the Puerta de Cerrada now stands, the Plaza de Puerta de Cerrada now stands, you might be robbed. Robberies were rife in medieval times, and everybody wanted to live in the safety of the city walls. So that's another story. You can find out a lot more about both of these topics if you hire me for a tour, of course, because I take people around these areas and go a bit more deeply into the history. And there are things to see. I won't give any spoilers right now. Another historical story might be Manuela Malasaña. there's a Calle de Manuela Malasaña, and this is, of course, up north in the very trendy now neighbourhood of Malasaña. You might be surprised to know that Malasaña isn't the official name for the neighbourhood, but it's the one that's become the name of the neighbourhood ever since the Movida Madrileña, that explosion of artistic creativity that happened in the 80s up in the area now known as Malasaña. The area, which is much larger, is officially called Universidad and refers to the university that then moved up further north to the area around Moncloa. Anyway, let's get back to Manuela Malasaña, because that's related to the Plaza dos de Mayo, where there was an uprising against the French invasion in 1808 on the 2nd of May. And Manuela Malasaña is one of many female victims of the French. Interestingly, her father was a French baker. She was a seamstress, and the stories about how she died varied, but more or less along the lines that she was carrying a pair of scissors. A French soldier saw that as a threat and executed her. Hence, she gets her name on the street. Along with, there were other heroines like Clara del Rey, and you can see her statue in the area of Malasaña. Okay, so let's move on to the very last one I'd like to add in my update to street signs in Madrid, and that one is Calle de la Pasa. Calle de la Pasa runs down from one of my favorite secret little squares, Plaza Conde de Barajas, which is one of the few squares not few actually, there's quite a few of them, little squares in central Madrid that aren't absolutely teeming with tourists, and where you can take a coffee at a cafe. I think Federal Cafe is there, which is kind of trendy, but also a great cafe. And yeah, Calle de la Pasa just runs down from that, and is an even quieter street that leads to a even quieter area. That's one of my favorite parts of quiet Madrid. I'm going to give a little plug to my upcoming book that I'll be selling on my website soon, called Quiet Madrid, which tells you all about the little corners of Madrid, the little hidden corners where you can go and take a breather. And it runs the gamut from museums to parks to neighborhoods. There's maps in it that bring it all together. And it's really written because while I love writing for Lonely Planet and covering all the big sites and everything, I'm also a little bit of an introvert. So I'm more of an ambivert. So I enjoy the full-onness of Madrid, but I like, my introverted side likes to go and explore these tiny areas. And the area that Calle de la Pasa is very typifies those kinds of areas that I've learned about, where I can catch my breath and breathe. And I wanted to write a book for all my fellow ambiverts and introverts, to tell them about where they can catch their breath and breathe in the city and enjoy a little bit of a slower pace in Madrid. Anyway, getting back to Calle de la Pasa, this street is interesting because it's named because there used to be the Archbishop's residence located here at number 3. In fact, if you go around the corner, you can see the symbol of the Archbishop on one of the doors. But this is sort of a side entrance to the Archbishop's palace, where they would go and give alms to the beggars outside in the form of a handful of raisins. And what is a raisin in Spanish? It's pasa. And of course, pasa has 2 meanings in Spanish, which means it can mean raisin or it can mean pass. So in the 18th century, this led to the fact that there was a common saying, "Quien no pasa por la calle de la Pasa no se casa." And that means whoever doesn't go through the Calle de la Pasa won't get married. And this wasn't actually superstition. You really did have to go through the Calle de la Pasa to get married in Madrid, because before being married, you would have to get permission from the Archbishop's residence. So it's really strictly true. And of course, in that time, everyone was Catholic. You weren't allowed to be Jewish or Muslim. So to get married, you would have to get the Archbishop's permission. The saying moved a little bit because the Archbishop's residence moved to Calle Bailen. So then they started saying, si no pasas por Bailen, no te casas bien. If you don't pass through Bailen, you won't marry well. But this fascinates me, this whole thing about having to go and get permission, because it actually relates to my own experience of getting married in Spain. And astonishing to me was the fact that it's much easier to get married in Spain to this day. There's much less paperwork if you're Catholic. Now, my mother-in-law organized my wedding in Tarancon, a small town outside of Madrid, sort of between Madrid and Cuenca. And she told us this, and we were astonished, but indeed it was true. We thought she was just saying it to suit herself so we could have a big fancy church wedding, but it was 100% true. And we decided just to cut the red tape and to keep my mother, who was a Catholic at that time. Sorry, she's no longer a Catholic. That's another story for another day. And my mother-in-law, who is a Catholic, but like many Spaniards, doesn't go to church, but likes a big Catholic wedding. To appease them and to make things more simple for ourselves, we got married in the Catholic Church. Despite the fact that neither of us believe, I would say we're both agnostic or atheist. So we had to go and see a priest. We were living in the UK at the time, so we had to go and see a priest in the UK. And I'm afraid he was a little bit scandalized by the whole thing, not knowing that it's much easier to get married as a Catholic in Spain than if you're going to have a laico wedding, which is, oh my God, I can't believe this. Sometimes I remember the Spanish word and don't remember the English word, laico. Yeah, a layperson. So you're not a Catholic. This is kind of interesting too to me, because although I don't think things should be this way, this is a hangover from very, very Catholic times, I do think the idea of visiting the priest before getting married in some ways was an attempt by the Catholic Church to make sure that people married well. So the idea is the priest actually interviews you and finds out how compatible you are. So part of it is not only showing that you are good little Catholics and that you're going to have lots and lots of babies. It's also to see if you're suited. Unfortunately, priests can't get married and have no idea about what makes a good marriage. So the Catholic Church started up something called the Catholic Marriage Organization in England, in Britain, sorry, and my mum was actually a counsellor for that, and she's now a therapist and counsellor for married couples. I said she left the church, but she gained all her expertise actually working for this organization. And yeah, sorry, that was just a little side note, a digression, but I hope you find it interesting. I don't know if that organization exists in Spain, so it's something I'll have to have a look into. Getting back to our wedding, of course, we did have a big, huge Spanish wedding. with all the bells and whistles. I never imagined that this would be where my life would take me. I'd always imagined that if I had a wedding, it would be in a registry office and I'd just have a big cheap party in a community centre, something like that. But that was totally out of my hands. I wasn't in Spain to organise it. I had my mother-in-law organise the whole thing, bless her, and it was a fantastic do. She pulled out all the stops. And because this is just traditional in Spain and my husband comes from a very traditional Spanish family, the whole thing was huge. There was about 200 people there and I didn't speak much Spanish at all. I think I had to memorize my vows in Spanish, not really knowing what I was saying, although of course Sergio gave me a translation. But it was a really good blast and lots of people came over from the UK and really, really enjoyed it. Like any Spanish wedding, it went on until the wee hours of the morning. It was still going on at 4 a.m. The poor Brits all got plastered, not realizing they had to pace themselves for that long. They all thought that the hors d'oeuvres and the drinks were just the reception and they would be getting no more. And then they had to sit down after stuffing their faces with hors d'oeuvres and drinking all the drinks they could get their hands on, sit down to this huge blowout meal with yet more alcohol. My cousin told me who was my bridesmaid. She told me it was the most drunk she's ever been in her life, but she also had a lot of fun. And of course, everyone ended up proving that we Brits are terrible with booze, which I suppose there's an element of truth to that. Anyway, waffling on and on, but I feel like I've come to the end of this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to get some feedback from you, so please write to me if you feel like you enjoyed this, if you'd like more of something, less of the other. I went off script quite a bit and talked about personal matters as well as about my work. Did you enjoy that? Was it interesting to you? And something I've forgotten to do so far, but I should do, is say, if you enjoyed the show, please drop a review and subscribe. And thank you so much for listening. I hope this was an interesting show for you. All right. Bye-bye.